there, hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was a...
Really? I thought...
Well, was it? Well, I can tell you now, it was the worst royal engagement I ever did, a royal wedding I ever did, because Harry was determined to keep the newspapers away. For me, it was a disaster. And...
well, was that deliberate? You were made to feel unwelcome
I
at the
felt
wedding?
so. I felt... It wasn't just me, it was the whole of the British press. You know, they were, in many ways, badly treated. I think it was... Harry was angry.
I think it was a bit... Well, I think it was a little bit insolent. I think it was a little bit...
Can you even imagine being at a royal wedding where centuries of history, centuries of sacred tradition were tossed aside like old stage props from a Hollywood set? Well, Arthur Edwards, the man who has captured every royal milestone for decades, lived through that exact nightmare. And let's be real, if he struggled to keep his cool, you know the day must have been a total disaster.
Everything was done on long lenses. I mean, I tell you, had an 800mm lens photographing the guests arriving.
Arthur Edwards, blunt as ever, doesn't sugarcoat it. He calls Harry and Meghan's wedding the worst royal wedding he has ever covered. Think about that for a moment. This is the man who stood behind his camera lens at Charles and Diana's glittering fairy tale, at William and Kate's flawless love story, and even at the coronations of monarchs who defined history. If he says Meghan and Harry's big day was the worst, that's not casual gossip. That's a dagger straight into the heart of royal reputation.
They engaged for the job, was 5 feet away, you know, it was just hopeless. And then the carriage shot, when they went past me in the carriage, they looked...
Because let's be honest, what millions saw on TV that day wasn't real. It was a perfectly staged piece of theater designed for the cameras. Every shot was polished, every moment choreographed to screen perfection. But Edwards, he was there in the suffocating atmosphere, watching the misery unfold. The truth behind those glossy images was a room full of sweaty, uncomfortable guests who were fuming in silence. He remembers it vividly, the unbearable heat, women clutching their fans like lifelines, their makeup running down their cheeks, hairstyles collapsing, designer gowns stuck to damp skin. And through it all, whispers rippled across the chapel, disbelief hanging in the air as the day dragged on endlessly.
About Meghan, and quite rightly, some of the things that were said about Meghan during the engagement were pretty harsh. I want to sort of mention them now, but some of them were pretty unfair as well. And so he was angry.
Edwards admits he didn't just leave Windsor Castle disappointed that day, he left disgusted. Disgusted, and that word carries weight. For a man who had built his career respecting the monarchy, immortalizing its most defining moments, this wasn't a celebration of love and tradition. It was, in his eyes, a complete disaster. But before we get into the nitty-gritty chaos of that wedding day, let's make something very clear. Arthur Edwards is not some bitter outsider throwing stones from the sidelines. No, he's been the royal photographer for The Sun since 1977. Almost half a century of loyalty. He's traveled alongside the royals, been there for births, marriages, deaths, moments most of us only read about. This man has seen it all. Charles and Diana's dazzling wedding, the heartbreak of Diana's funeral, the fairy tale perfection of William and Kate, even King Charles's coronation.
You know, I've done some really lovely royal weddings. I did both King Charles's weddings. I did William's wedding. I did.
Edwards has documented 7 royal weddings, 5 funerals, 8 births, and decades of history through his lens. If the royals have lived it, Arthur has been there, and the royals respect him for it. William and Kate have publicly thanked him. Even Harry himself once joked with him during shoots. This wasn't some outsider begging for scraps. Edwards was welcomed into the inner circles of the monarchy. He knew the protocols, the traditions, the gravity of these moments. So when a man like this says Meghan and Harry's wedding was the absolute worst he's ever covered, you can't brush it off as clickbait. This isn't speculation. This isn't gossip spun from thin air.
There were lovely occasions, but that today, I couldn't get out of Windsor quick enough, I promise you that
the
day.
worst royal wedding to cover.
Yeah, and then when the baby was born, when Archie was born, that was another, in my view, a disaster, because I knew we was not going to get a picture.
This is the raw, unfiltered judgment of the monarchy's most trusted lensman. Edwards wasn't watching from a distance. He was right there, camera in hand, as everything fell apart in real time. And the very first disaster? The brutal, suffocating heat. Edwards recalls the Windsor sun blazing down on St. George's Chapel with no mercy. Guests, trapped inside the sweltering chapel, looked like they were fighting for survival. Women clutched fans desperately, hair and makeup melting away before vows were even spoken. Designer gowns, carefully chosen for this once-in-a-lifetime event, were drenched in sweat. It wasn't romance, it was survival. Forget elegance.
William was born, and Harry was born, and George and Charlotte and Louis. We got great pictures outside the hospital. I remember, And William and Catherine especially.
Forget magic. The reality was sweat and discomfort. Edwards watched guests fanning themselves, their misery impossible to hide once the cameras zoomed out. It wasn't the refined, graceful affair the world had imagined. It was suffocating. But here's what really shook Edwards. He didn't believe it was just bad luck with the weather. No, he says it felt deliberate. Guest comfort didn't matter. What mattered was Hollywood glamour, shiny images for global broadcasts. Behind those forced smiles and staged poses, chaos reigned. For a man who had stood in rain, endured wind, and braved the unpredictable British weather at countless royal events.
The baby had been born many hours earlier. We were led to believe it was going to be a home birth, and it was at a hospital. There was that. The whole thing was just.
This was the most miserable experience of all. Something meant to be the pinnacle of romance and tradition felt more like punishment. And the heat, that was only the beginning, because the real slap in the face came with the seating arrangements. Edward's voice drips with disgust when he recalls what he saw. Celebrities, strangers with no real bond to the couple, were seated front and center. Meanwhile, royals who had given decades of service to the crown, veterans, and family members were shoved to the back like nobodies. Oprah Winfrey, who had barely exchanged a handful of words with Meghan and Harry before the big day, sat in prime position. George and Amal Clooney, who later admitted they didn't even know the couple that well, were treated like royalty. And where were the actual royals?
Camilla in I think Munich, the first pictures of Archie that was taken by the Press Association. I remember showing her on my phone, and she sort of, and that was the first time she saw him, so.
The people who had sacrificed and served for the monarchy, squinting from the far rows, left out of sight. For Edwards, this wasn't a wedding, it was a red carpet circus. He remembers thinking it felt like a Hollywood movie premiere, not a sacred royal celebration. Tradition, loyalty, decades of service, all meaningless compared to how good a celebrity would look in the photographs. And here's the kicker. Even Edwards himself was shoved aside. After decades of service, decades of loyalty, his seat was so far back he bitterly joked he needed a GPS just to find it. His view was blocked, his presence ignored, while Hollywood elites strutted into their front row seats. Guests whispered to each other, stunned by the message Meghan and Harry were sending. Family came second, image came first. Guests weren't the only ones who felt humiliated. The press, those very people who carried the monarchy's image to the world, were treated with outright contempt. Edwards recalls it bitterly. While Hollywood stars glided into their prime seats, seasoned royal photographers like him were banished. They were forced to stand at absurd distances, their lenses stretched to the limit just to capture basic arrival shots. Edwards knew what he was watching, the dismantling of everything the monarchy stood for. For Edwards, that was the proof. It had never been about family. It was about profit. Every accusation became content. Every rupture became marketable. The monarchy was humiliated live on American television while Harry and Meghan cashed in. Looking back, Edwards believes the wedding itself had been the blueprint. None of it was accident. The chaos, the snubs, the demolition of tradition, it was all calculated. The wedding wasn't about honoring the monarchy. It was about launching the Meghan and Harry brand. Every insult became currency. Every disaster became justification. From Netflix deals to blockbuster book contracts, they monetized the drama. The wedding wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a billion-dollar beginning. By rejecting tradition, humiliating family, and weaponizing victimhood, they created the perfect narrative to sell. And the most bitter truth? It worked. They transformed themselves from dutiful royals into global celebrities, from family members into media moguls. For Edwards, who had seen everything, Meghan and Harry's wedding wasn't just the worst he had ever covered. It was the most deliberate betrayal of royal tradition in modern history. Arthur Edwards, now 85, looks back at that wedding not as a milestone, but as a warning sign. One the world missed at the time. He says the signs of fracture, rebellion, and resentment were all there, playing out in real time for anyone who dared to look past the glamour. The suffocating chapel heat, the cruel seating plan, the icy war with the press, the minimalist canapes, and the deliberate snubbing of tradition, it wasn't sloppy planning, it was foreshadowing, and the fallout only proved him right. In the months after the wedding, tension within the royal family hardened into ice, invitations stopped flowing, events that once brought cousins together now passed in silence. Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace became distant fortresses. Harry and Meghan's choice to put brand over blood meant children missed out on grandparents, and grandparents were robbed of time they could never reclaim. For Edwards, the tragedy was personal. He had watched families within the monarchy grow across generations. He'd seen joy, grief, unity, and resilience. But with Harry and Meghan, he saw division weaponized. Privacy was twisted into punishment, duty into disdain. The monarchy's greatest strength, continuity, was shattered. He recalls one story with a heavy heart. The Queen, the woman who had reigned with dignity through wars, scandals, and national tragedies, was forced to see the first picture of Archie not from her grandson, but on a reporter's phone. Can you imagine? The monarch, the matriarch of the House of Windsor, left waiting like an outsider. That image, Edwards insists, says everything about the damage. And he's blunt about it. You can't can't have your cake and eat it too. But Meghan and Harry tried, and to Edward's dismay, they succeeded. By walking away from duty, they gained freedom. By accusing the monarchy of cruelty, they gained sympathy. And by weaponizing their victimhood, they gained millions. It infuriates Edwards because while they prospered, the monarchy bled. Every accusation humiliated the institution he had dedicated his life to documenting. Every staged interview undermined decades of service from others in the family, and every carefully crafted grievance widened the rift that once seemed unthinkable. He calls the Oprah interview the breaking point, the final nail, 90 minutes of calculated drama, framed with lighting and pauses worthy of Hollywood, broadcast across the globe. The accusations of racism, the claims of cruelty, it wasn't healing, Edwards says, it was performance. Performance with profit as its reward. And the saddest part? It worked. The headlines roared, public opinion shifted, and for a moment, Harry and Meghan became the most talked about couple in the world, not for their love, not for their service, but for their grievances. Edwards doesn't mince words. He says the monarchy gave them everything: Frogmore Cottage, freedom to come and go, opportunities to return if they wanted. The door was left open, but instead of gratitude, he saw exploitation. They cashed in on the very heritage they claimed to resent. And here's where the real sting lies. Whether they call themselves royals or not, the world still treats them as such. Every deal, every appearance, every paycheck, they're in demand because of the titles, the family name, the very monarchy they worked so hard to undermine. Edwards says it outright. The system gave them the platform, and they used it not to honor, but to destroy. Looking back, Edwards believes history will see Meghan and Harry's wedding for what it was. Not a celebration, but a turning point. Not a fairy tale, but a fracture. The moment when two people turned centuries of tradition into props for their personal stage. He says it was betrayal. Calculated, deliberate betrayal. And as the monarchy scrambled to preserve dignity in the years after, Harry and Meghan built an empire from the rubble. Netflix, memoirs, staged interviews, all fueled by the chaos of that Windsor day. For Arthur Edwards, the memory of that wedding still burns. It wasn't just the worst wedding he ever covered, it was the most painful, because he knew what it symbolized. The end of something sacred, the start of something shallow. And as he reflects on his career, spanning nearly 5 decades, his words cut deeper than any tabloid headline. Meghan and Harry's wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a carefully orchestrated betrayal of royal tradition. The day love took a backseat to branding, and family was sacrificed at the altar of fame. Arthur Edwards doesn't gossip for the sake of gossip. He has seen too much, captured too much to rely on hearsay. His judgment is grounded in decades of service, decades of trust. And when he says this was the lowest point, you better believe it mattered. Because behind the veils and vows, behind the carriage and cameras, behind the avocado toast and Instagram aesthetics, this wasn't the story of a royal wedding. It was the story of the monarchy's most shocking betrayal. A betrayal Arthur Edwards witnessed firsthand through the lens of his camera and will never forget.